Good morning. Welcome back to the Central Ohio Compact's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion series, The Conversation, exploring regional equity strategies and practices here in Central Ohio. My name is Charles Noble. I am an administrator here at Columbus State and also an assistant attorney general. I have the pleasure of moderating this first panel today and hosting the event. The Central Ohio Compact was established in 2011 with the goal of providing 65% post-secondary educational attainment and degree credentialing for adults in Central Ohio by 2025. I'd like to thank our internal partners who have done an incredible amount of work trying to help us get this diversity series to the market so that you're able to enjoy, be inspired, and leave with some additional information around what you can do to continue to drive equity work within your organization. Specifically, I'd like to thank ESC. I'd like to thank Dr. Harrison. I'd like to thank the Central Ohio Compact and the steering committee, as well as all of you for engaging in this very important conversation. Finally, I'd like to thank our host of the last session, Christy Angel and the YWCA, for graciously agreeing to host that session and also providing us with access to their agitators and activists racial equity event. Last session, we utilized data to frame the distribution of racial opportunity in Central Ohio. We started off with the conversation around redlining and what some of the implications were for redlining as it relates to now the racial mobility or the racial e-mobility and racial segregation here in Central Ohio. It was some pretty interesting data that helped to paint a picture around how policies, practices, and law have created some systemic barriers to all within Central Ohio being able to access their dreams, their visions, and reach their full potential. Today, we're going to be focusing on some discrete activities that folks in Central Ohio are doing with the incredible panel that we've assembled for you all that's going to actually look at the second part of this conversation. The second part is, what can we do and what is happening now so that we can kind of tie a nice bow. And so we know that there's still going to be a lot of work to do around reaching real high goals of racial equity here in Central Ohio, but we know that good work is ongoing. And this platform is designed to present some of that work, both from the industry perspective and then following up in the K-12 perspective. A few housekeeping items. We are going to be posting announcements, links, and information in the chat box at the bottom of your screen. And so please be on the lookout for that. In addition, we heard feedback and we're going to make this session more engaging, more interactive. So at the bottom of your screen, you're going to see a Q&A box. In that Q&A box, you're going to be able to submit questions that we're going to get asked and answered by the panelists a little bit later in this session. Please feel free to fire off as many questions as you like. Know though that we won't get to every question that's asked, but we are going to try to lift up some themes and answer as many as we can. Before I turn to the introduction of the panel, I want to just frame this a little bit for the folks that are attending. So this work is hard work. This work takes a lot of effort, takes a lot of thoughtfulness, and really it takes a lot of time. And so as you're thinking about what you can do, as you hear examples that are coming from our panelists, please try to ground those examples in your own experience so that as you leave here, these examples are personal to you and that you're able then through that personal lens to go back and be invigorated for the work that you're doing within your own organization. So I'm going to start now with an introduction of our panelists. If our panelists for the first panel can turn on their videos. So we have Trudy Bartley, the Associate Vice President of Local Government and Community Relations at The Ohio State University. Trudy's going to be walking us through some really interesting work that's going on at the Wexner Medical Center. We have Corrine Berger, the Managing Director and Chief Control Manager at Jpmorgan Chase. Corrine is also a Board of Trustee member at Columbus State Community College, and we're very lucky for her expertise. We have LaShawn Carter, the Assistant Executive Director and Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer at Franklin County Children's Services. Had incredible opportunities to speak with LaShawn about the work that he's doing, and I think he's really going to add some incredible insight. And then finally, we have Kiana Williams, the Vice President of Culture, Engagement, and Inclusion, and the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer at Ohio Health. Kiana, in addition to her many accolades, is also Queen Kiana Williams. And so we're really happy to have her and excited to get her frame of reference. So thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to getting started. So before I start, I'd like to just frame up a couple of the definitions that we saw in our last panel. The first definition was around individual racism. And so individual racism is the prejudgment, bias, or discrimination by an individual based on race. Institutional racism was defined as discriminatory treatment, unfair policies, and inequitable opportunities based on race, produced and perpetuated by institutions. And finally, structural racism encompasses history and current realities of institutional racism across all institutions, combining to create a system that negatively impacts communities of color. And so as we think about this conversation today, the part about individual racism is not really going to be our focus. It's really going to be more about how institutions can play a role in the development of better racial equitable practices. And so keep those terms in mind as we move forward. So with no further ado, we are going to get to our panel. Let's see. So making sure I have everyone. Thank you. So we're going to kick our first question off to LaShawn Carter, and I'd like for all of the panelists to answer this question. So in about a minute or less, can you please give us your definition of racial equity?
Well, thanks, and good morning, Charles, and good morning, everyone. So my definition of racial equity is kind of twofold. First, I would say that race is the prism through which all other forms of equity truly pass, as it is anchored in the historical texture of our country. And so racialized equity then is giving everyone the supports that they need, but specifically understanding the nuances and the lived experiences of those peoples of the global majority or peoples of color that are in our community. And so when thinking about how we look at what sources or resources are available, we don't provide everyone the exact same thing. We truly engage and interact with people to learn what their needs are, and then make sure we provide them with the necessary tools and access to be able to achieve their goals and whatever outcomes we're hoping for as we are doing this work as a community.
Thank you, LaShawn. You made great points. I'm going to be following up on a couple of those momentarily. Trudy, could you answer the same question in about a minute or less? Help us understand from your perspective, what does racial equity mean?
Racial equity truly is looking at the world through intentionality, understanding that there are differences, and understanding and really intentionally making a difference, looking at having or achieving a level playing field, understanding our history as far as how those inequities started from 400 years ago, where there were policies and acts that were intentionally instituted to prevent the upward mobility of people of color, and how that has escalated over the years through really obvious as well as unintended consequences that have resulted in the disparities that we see in our neighborhoods. Whether it's redlining, whether it is education that is not as it should be in certain neighborhoods, whether it is a lack of access to food, lack of affordable housing, those inequities have been built upon for 400 years when you think about how our country started. And how do we, from an anti-racist lens, really look at privilege, really look at issues of the day that many people take for granted, and be intentional as far as reacting, not ignoring, but reacting and being part of the solution. So therefore, we can assist individuals from a humanistic standpoint get to where their opportunities are for their own success.
Thank you, Trudy. A lot to unpack. I wish we had 2 more hours for this conversation. Um, Based on the intersectionality that Trudy's just lifted up for us, I'm going to turn to Kiana to provide us, from your vantage point, the same question. Please help us define your understanding of racial equity.
Yeah, so thanks, Charles. And again, thanks for having me. You know, what both Trudy and LaShawn said really resonate for me. And at the end of the day, I think that we achieve racial equity when race is not a determiner of someone's socioeconomic status, when it's not a determiner of someone's health outcomes, when it's not a determiner of someone's educational outcomes. And I think that that's kind of the underpinning of what you heard and what both Trudy and LaShawn were talking about. But then I think the other piece is that when we ensure that people who are impacted by racial inequity are meaningfully and actively engaged in dismantling systems and policies and practices that continue to perpetuate racial inequity. When those individuals are at the table and have a voice in kind of dismantling those systemic issues, then that's when you really achieve racial equity.
Thank you, Kiana. And so, Karine, given everything that we've heard from your 3 other panelists, what would your definition of racial equity be?
Yeah, so thank you to my former 3 panelists. They summed up it, very well. But I would probably add in, one additional piece to what Kiana just mentioned, which, today in the U.S., the biggest predictor of success is the zip code that you were born into and or grew up in. And, I think we need to really unpack that and understand that particular statistic. And to me, that is like one of the underpinnings of inequities. And what are the gaps that exist because of, that statistic? Do we understand the gaps, and how do we address and close the gaps? I think until we really understand why that is the biggest predictor of success, how to address that, we're not going to be able to really move the needle on some of these things. And that's really where we have to, kind of get down in, be intentional and be purposeful. And, some of the things that the panelists said all kind of wrap up together in that.
Thank you, Karine. And I think that's a great segue for the next topic of discussion. And so we do know that zip codes have a disturbingly predictable or predictive value in thinking about the life outcomes of folks. And so maybe I'll start with you, LaShawn. Thinking about some of the work that you're doing at Franklin County Children's Services, can you talk to us a little bit about the intersection of education and equity as it relates to your work?
So, speaking specifically about Franklin County Children's Services, I think what we're doing is truly trying to provide for better supports and access to high quality education for the children inside of the foster care system. I think what we've recognized is that education is the #1 pathway out of your conditions, right? And so what we've been thinking about is, 1, how do we know for certain what impact coming in contact with a system like ours has on the lives of children? There has not historically been a good way to understand that. And what education offers us is a way to set some common data, some common understandings around the experience of being in foster care, and then providing for the resources necessary and also the intentional advocacy to ensure that their outcomes are what we would hope for our own children. And what's also true about that is paying attention to not only just the experience that those young people are having, but also the responsiveness of the school systems in which they're attending. Because what's also true, in as important as race is, it's also about identity. And so we've been very intentional about ensuring that the full lives and the full identities of these young people, once they become known to us, is fully seen and realized inside the learning environment. And so in the way that has played out for us has kind of been twofold. In addition to us informing and engaging school districts, it's also been about informing and teaching our young people how to speak up and show up for themselves, and giving them some language of internal agency and activism so that they can advocate for their own selves and their own lives and their own goals and outcomes. Because I think it's also important that youth voice is a part of this discussion, because we have a lot of adults talking about a lot of things, but our young people are the ones that will inspire the change, and they'll be the ones that will inherit this world. And so including them in the conversation early and often is going to be an important aspect to how you can address not only the inequities of a child, particularly a child of color, inside of a foster care system, but also as it relates to their world in terms of their learning environments, in the places and spaces in which they learn and grow.
Thank you, LaShawn. Kiana, this next question is going to you based on something that LaShawn just mentioned. And so thinking about the predictive effect of zip code, we can more or less tell how long someone will live, average lifespan, how much they're going to make over the course of their life, how sick they're going to get and how often they're going to get sick. There really is a lot of data that helps us to unfortunately predict, where these outcomes will fall. And so healthcare obviously is a critical element to stability. Can you help us understand a little bit, from the agency perspective of helping to have folks at the table who can be part of the conversation around their own health and wellness? What does racial equity look like in the health space?
Yeah, Charles, it's a really good question, because there are intersections between education, employment, and healthcare, right? If somebody is, too sick, right, for a variety of reasons, they may call off of work, right? And then that could get them in a precarious position from being able to hold down their job. If they're too sick, right, then it may impact their ability to fully learn. And so as we think about the impact of healthcare, we need to understand that its tentacles into so many things that impact their socioeconomic status, their ability to thrive. And so, some of the things that we're doing, and, I know Trudy can build on this too, based on, the things that are happening at Wexner, but some of the things that we're doing, number one, is looking at the composition of our medical staff, right? And so there's a ton of research that suggests, greater diversity in who's caring for patients impacts healthcare outcomes in a meaningful way. So having more physicians and clinicians of color impacts the health outcomes for our patients. And so, and that's all patients. So, a lot of times people think, so are you saying that Black patients should have Black doctors? Well, there's research, and, again, shout out to, Dr. Quinn Capers, who was at the Ohio State University. But there's a ton of research that he's presented that shows that even non-Black patients, right, do better when they have physicians of color. So, there is a ton of research around that. So that's one aspect of it. Are you diversifying, who's caring for patients? But then the other aspect of it is, are we clear on what health disparities are and how we impact those health disparities? So if we know, for instance, that African-American communities have a higher incidence of diabetes, or have, longer wait times in EDs, or whatever those things are, how are we impacting those aspects of the care continuum to ensure that we're actually addressing those things? As a child, I had asthma, and I remember, constantly going, to the emergency department, or, my, family practitioner, all of those types of things. But I also remember how it kept me out of school, or how it prevented me from doing certain things. And so, those things continue to be exacerbated in communities of color. And so if we aren't being really intentional about those things, and if we're not putting a laser-like focus on that, we then end up perpetuating those things from generation after generation.
Oh, well said. I'll turn to you, Trudy, now to pick up on, or I'm sorry, did you want to jump in, Kareen? Okay, I'll turn to Trudy for a second then to just jump in, and then I have a question lined up for you, Kareen. So Trudy, one of the things that you mentioned in the beginning of your, in the first questions you were asked was the cumulative effect of policy, of access to opportunity or the relative lack thereof, and how these things sort of intersect. And so Kiana gave you a shout out around some of the work that's happening at Ohio State. Do you want to pick up on that comment and then kind of walk us through this from your perspective?
Yes, before I get to what the action plan is for Wexner Medical, I really want to give a shout out to the Franklin County Commissioners and their bold effort around the poverty task force that they started 2 years ago, because a lot of what we're seeing that is happening in Central Ohio really came out of that. When we started from a grassroots standpoint to talk to individuals who were in poverty, to understand what their barriers were as far as success, as far as getting out of assistance. And it culminated in the idea, or what we've seen around the country in Columbus with the declarations and the resolutions as far as racism being a public health crisis. It's not only a public health crisis, but it's a crisis in the policies, as we talked about before, that have been instituted and carried out that have been more punitive than helpful as far as helping individuals and people of color to get out of the conditions that they are currently in, whether it be education, whether it is workforce, whether it is housing. And so from that, I think we've seen a resonation around Central Ohio, whether it is from our health systems, our corporate partners, and our public partners, to really look at intentionally about racist or racism within their own institutions. And so we, as a university, as well as a medical center, looked at this in June and said, we've got to elevate this cause, because we've got to make anti-racism our foundation for everything that we do. We've got to engage our faculty and staff and students and patients to learn and participate in anti-racist efforts. We've got to equip our team members with tools and channels to report issues and suggest ideas that move us forward. And we have to empower everyone to address racism and to understand the change that happens or does not happen without all of us participating. And the big thing about this is that we're doing this, and we're also going to add an evaluation component to it to see if we're on the right track as far as how we move the needle forward at Wexner Medical. So we are also looking at doing the same on the university side. As you know, prior to Dr. Drake leaving, he started a anti-racist task force for racism and racial inequities. It's co-chaired by our Dean of Social Work, as well as our Vice Provost for Diversity and Inclusion, Dr. James Moore. And it's a university-wide task force that is really looking at inequities that are tangible and intangible, and making recommendations for a more healthy and supportive and nurturing community within the university. As everyone knows, Ohio State is its own city within a city. So we believe that if we can really partner with those community groups or those other partners outside with what we're doing, we as a land grant institution can really make a difference and a change, not only within our campus area, but also within Central Ohio. So Dr. Drake started a $1 million seed fund for just research and opportunities for grants with our community partners that are really going to be impactful and make change. And then from there, we are really aligning ourselves with the action plan of Wexner Medical. Now, looking at the anti-racist action plan for Wexner Medical, as I said, we started it in June. We established an oversight committee. We've developed 9 action groups. We've launched those action groups. We've engaged our faculty, staff, and community. In October, we actually started implementing some of the initiatives that came out of our action groups. And let me give you an idea of what those action groups are. It is overseen by our Chancellor, Hal Paz. He oversees the Anti-Racism Action Plan. We have our co-chair is Dr. Nwando Aloha, and she is the chair of family medicine. And we also have Autumn Glover, who's a co-chair. And what we are doing is, as I said, there are 9 areas we're looking at. We're looking at education and training. We have an action plan for employment, engagement, and advancement. We have an action plan for policy and advocacy. We're looking at population health and community engagement, faculty training and development. We're looking at resources for partners and external partners, patient experience and clinical services, communication, and as I said before, we are also looking at an evaluative component. And through our group, we've had an alignment with some of the groups that we have within Wexner Medical, being Women in Science and Industry. We have a diversity council that has come out of that. And we also have had an health equity subcommittee, which is currently working on a specific community site on the Near East Side. We purchased the former King Lincoln Library, and we're looking at how do we have a health and equity community center. Some of the initiatives, and one I think that will be really impactful, is our 21-day anti-racism challenge. We're challenging individuals within Wexner Medical to really educate themselves within a 21-day period. We want them to have the opportunity to understand the power of what is privilege, what is supremacy, what is systemic racism and oppression and equity as an individual, in a group, and a unit or a department. And we're asking individuals to read, look at books, listen to podcasts, watch videos, and really kind of reflect on ways to deepen the community conversations that we can have at the medical center. From there, we've also started our roundtables on racism. We had our first roundtable with Dr. Paz, Alex Fisher, President Hardin, our OSU Chief of Police, Monica Mall, and Adam H. And what we talked about is what are the safe spaces and safe communities around racism. And as I said, this is going to be a constantly evolving kind of issue for us as a university and a medical center. We are publishing this information in medical journals and higher ed. We have a constant communication that goes out to our faculty and staff from the chancellor. And we also have set up an anti-racism resource guide, which really refers back to resources as podcasts, readings, articles that can really assist individuals to become anti-racist. So we're really being very intentional as far as how we move forward as an institution, not only as Wexner Medical, but also as the Ohio State University.
I mean, that is extensive, Trudy, and I want to open up this to any panelists now to respond to anything that you've heard Trudy just walk through the very intentional approach that Ohio State has to working through some of these issues. Any comments? Anything interesting? Anything that you want to pick up on?
No, I think the outline that Trudy just went through really does demonstrate that, this is an intentional and purposeful approach that the university is taking towards addressing racism. And, addressing this, it has to be an active process. And at Jpmorgan Chase, we're doing similar types of programs to actively address racism. We have Advancing Black Pathways, which is something that we focused on internally and externally to help focus on wealth, education, and careers in in the financial institutions areas. We've got Advancing Black Leaders, which again is an intentional program that we've done as well to address some of the similar things that I think Trudy had mentioned that the university is trying to address, including trying to attract and hire and retain our Black talent in our company. So it has to be purposeful, it has to be intentional, and it has to be repeatable.
Thank you for that, Karine. Any Kiana or LaShawn, anything you want to follow up on from either what you've heard Trudy or Karine mention?
I'll just add quickly that intentionality, right? And I think we're going to talk about it later as it relates to this idea that the same intentionality that went behind establishing the system of oppression is required to dismantle it. There has to be some process, an intentional process by which you can hold yourself accountable to addressing the influence that racism has had on your system. And so I think that what Trudy has laid out and what Karine has said is exactly that, is these intentional pieces that you embed in your system that will lead to the disruption, the initial disruption, but the ultimate dismantlement of the influence that racism has had on all of our systems.
So I want to go a little bit deeper with you, LaShawn, on this point. And so we know that, so everything that Karine has walked through and that Trudy has walked through has really given us, I think, a great framework to think about how to move through this work intentionally. The context is that there is a need to work through this, through various cultural issues, through things that have occurred in society and things that have been perpetuated. And so can you talk a little bit about the influence of culture and the need to lift up an intentional approach to mediate or mitigate some of the effects of racism and some of the legacies of racism?
Yeah, that's a great question, Charles. And here's what I will say. Many of us approach this work through this idea that if we can strategically plan our way out of it. But as Peter Drucker said many years ago, culture eats strategy for lunch. And I would say that equity eats culture for dinner. And because I think what's true is there's an attack on racism, but there's also an attack on culture. Because here's what's also true. Many people are approaching the work of equity, especially racialized equity, through this thought that there's a monolithic approach to addressing the needs of people of color. And that's not the reality. The reality is that embedded in that racial construct is many different lived experiences and many cultures that influence how we interact with the world. And so in order for an organization to be able to address those differences, they first have to be identifying themselves as a responsive organization, one that is culturally humble, but then also one is culturally curious, being able to engage in thoughtful dialogue with their constituents to understand truly how culture is influencing the way that they work, what they show up with, what their lived experiences are. Because what's true about any associate that works for any organization, you arrive with a certain set of beliefs and values. And those beliefs and values are core to that individual. And much of that is shaped by the world that surrounds them. And as you zoom out, it gets more complex. And it means that that individual has more complexities and nuances than sometimes we're willing to engage with. And so I think about culture, and I think about the ways that culture has influenced our work is that we're not culturally responsive. We're not culturally responsive enough to allow for people to be different in their space, be comfortable in that difference, and thus be intellectually curious enough to figure out how that can fit into what we're trying to accomplish as an organization or a system. There's this assumption inside of systems that in order for the system to be successful, people have to assimilate to the culture that has been predefined before new people arrive. What I would say is that every system is redefined as new people become a part of it. And I think that's the true essence of inclusion when you think about diversity, equity, inclusion, is that when a new organism or a new person comes into the system, they inform a new way of being inside of that system that is in full account for what they bring to the table, what their beliefs are, and how that fits into the structure. And so creating the space for that is an important component of how culture influences work. And so there's so many more ways in which we can go into that, but I think what's ultimately true is that we show up with fully realized identities. And in organizations that is trying to dismantle racism, you have to be able to figure out how you interact with your internal expertise. You have people that have a lived experience inside your system, figure out how you grant them some platform for those voices to be amplified, and then figure out how you respond as a system to what you're learning from them.
Thank you, LaShawn. I'm going to turn to you, Kiana, and ask you to follow up on a little bit of what LaShawn said. So we talked a little bit about how culture, what individuals show up with, institutional culture, all kind of cascade to create the environment that employees work in and that employees spend a good amount of time in. And so can you help us understand from Ohio Health and what you've been doing really kind of over the course of your career, how have you thought about, or what are some of the things that you've done through your leadership to help align culture and practice and activity so that there is a equitable lens, at each level of any of the organizations that you've worked with?
Yeah, it's a really great question, Charles. At the end of the day, that there's a ton of research that shows that culture work is diversity and inclusion work, and diversity and inclusion work is culture work, right? So the things that we're looking at from the standpoint of culture are the same things that we know drive diversity and inclusion work. So engagement. So are our associates engaged? Are they willing to go above and beyond? Do they have an intent to stay with the organization? When we look at those types of measures, when we look at measures around brand and our employee value proposition, our values, all of those things, right? Diversity and inclusion permeate all those things. And for us at Ohio Health, it's really about, are we creating a culture of belonging, right? So that no matter where a person is within the organization, they feel connected to the organization. They feel like they can bring their whole self to the organization and that they can thrive within the organization. And so what that means is that it's not only about the individual associate, right? It's also about leadership. And so how are we ensuring leadership accountability? Because, one of the things that we've learned in this particular moment is that people want to see more than, an organization, putting a black box on LinkedIn or, putting, out a statement saying Black Lives Matter. They want to make sure that the Black lives in the organization actually feel like they matter. And so for us, that means that leadership accountability is part and parcel to the work. And so some of the things that we've done is that we've actually tied diversity and inclusion to executive and leadership bonus, right? So it's a key metric within our organization. And one of the things that we know is that, you have to incentivize people, right, to do effective work. We incentivize people, with respect to patient outcomes. We incentivize people with respect to financial outcomes. We incentivize people with respect to quality outcomes. And so why wouldn't we be incentivizing people related to diversity, equity, and inclusion outcomes? And so we do that at Ohio Health. In addition to that, we ask our leaders to sponsor high-performing, high-potential leaders of color. And so we have a sponsorship program where all of our SVPs have an accountability to sponsor. And what we know is that sponsorship is much more than mentorship. Right? So sponsorship is about being willing to put your neck out for somebody, being willing to expend some political capital for someone, being willing to put somebody in your networks, being willing to vouch for that person when they're not in the room. And so that's when you start to have real meaning, right? Like that's when people start to be able to advance, is when somebody's willing to not only put their stamp on them, but also put their name on them. And so we've been really intentional about doing work like that. We've also been really intentional about looking at where disparities exist within our organization, so that if that's pay disparities, if that's health outcome disparities, if that's hiring disparities, right? So, being intentional, to LaShawn's point, is really important, but people want to see action, right? We've studied the issue for years and years. We've talked about the issue for years and years. Like, like, I'm not anti-intellectual, I believe in intellectualism, but we don't need another paper, right, to point to what the issue is. We don't need another research study. Like, look around your leadership team, right? That's all the data that you need, right? Like, look at levels below you, that's the data that you need. Now, we have also been intentional about pulling the data so that people can understand, because, and I'll make this last point. It's important to understand the data from an intersectional lens too. So we can look across the board and say there aren't people of color at a particular level in an organization. But when we start to really unpack that, are we talking about women of color? Are we talking about men of color? When we talk about disparities around pay, and a lot of people wanted to lean into gender equity in the largest sense of the word, but like, let's unpack that. And when we look at gender equity, is it white women? Is it all women? Is it women of color? Like, we have to be really clear about what is the problem that we're trying to solve so that we can actually solve the right problem.
Thank you. It's a lot to pick up on again, you and everyone else. One of the things that you mentioned is action, having a bias towards moving forward. And so, Karine, the next couple of questions are coming to you around action. And so at the end of October, Jpmorgan Chase donated $35 million across the nation. This isn't the first time that Jpmorgan Chase has supported in creating access to education and pathways for underserved individuals. So in addition to the altruistic mission of this work, what keeps Jpmorgan Chase invested in making these investments in communities across the country, and particularly here in Central Ohio?
Sure, thank you for that. At Jpmorgan Chase, our job is to serve our customers, and our customers are very diverse, not only in terms of racially, but also socioeconomic and just along the socioeconomic spectrum. And we believe that we need to have a workforce that not only represents our customers, but also understands our customer needs. So that's very important to our company. And we also know that workforces are changing, and skills and needs of those workforces are changing. If you look at financial institutions, historically, our lowest paying jobs are probably represented by, our more racially diverse population. And those jobs are starting to migrate, particularly as people are doing self-service, and mobile technology is becoming more and more prevalent, and we certainly are seeing that as part of the whole COVID situation that's been happening over the past 8-9 months. And a lot of those adoptions are happening a lot faster than we would have ever thought had we not had the COVID situation. And we certainly do not want to be a community that leaves people behind. And so it's very important that we think about how jobs are changing, how skills are changing. And so we've been very intentional about how we've been investing in our local community here in Columbus to try to address that. We did do a $2.5 million investment at Ohio State with Dr. Moore that's the Ohio State University of Diversity and Inclusion, and we're supporting scholarship programs there for the Young Scholars and Moral Scholar programs there. We invested $5 million to the 614 for Linden efforts that are helping in that particular zip code. We thought about, the original $2.5 million that we invested to start the Central Ohio Compact here. We increased that investment by another $1 million. And then, as you mentioned, we just announced a $7 million grant as part of the $35 million grant across the U.S. to the city of Columbus. And we're super excited about that. It's focused on Columbus City Schools, which we all know is important to the success of our community. So all those things together are, to address, what I say is the needs that we have of our workforce of the future, and making sure we are a community that does not leave people behind. And we have been very intentional about every single one of those investments.
Incredible. Yes.
Hi, it's Kiana. I wanted to make a point, if that's okay, related to So everybody, has lauded the work around advancing Black pathways, which is phenomenal that Jpmorgan Chase has done. One of the things that I just want to underscore about that work, I saw an interview with Jamie Dimon talking about, the work and its genesis. And one of the things that he pointed to was one of his board members, Melody Hobson. And he talked about how conversations with Melody and her pushing him were part of the reason why Jpmorgan Chase leaned into the space. And so for those who don't know who Melody is, right, African-American woman, executive, co-CEO of Ariel Investments. And the reason why I bring this up is because I think it underscores the importance of representation. And so having an executive on your board who understands these issues and is willing to push a senior leader in this space is in part what led to Jpmorgan Chase doing this. And that doesn't mean that, there wasn't a lot of intentionality going on in Jpmorgan Chase. I'm certainly not saying that, but I am talking about the importance of representation at every level within an organization and how essential that is for us to be able to move the needle on this work.
Charles, can I add to that? Because I think that is so important, particularly where we are in Columbus now. And it's a little bit about disruption, but it's about getting the point across that there's a fear to talk about. And I am going to quote LaShawn Carter, that it's not an uncomfortable conversation, it's a necessary conversation. And I use that all the time in all of my conversations now, in that it's okay to be uncomfortable, but it's necessary to have the conversation, because the conversation really exposes individuals who have different experiences to things that they are unaware of. And that exposure, as you were saying that Melody Hobson did, look at what it resulted in. And it was about a little disruption to say, let's have this conversation. It is probably a little uncomfortable, and I'm going to kind of educate you on some things that you may not be aware of, but this is how impactful it can be. And so each of us, at whatever levels we are, really, when we have the opportunity in the boardroom, in the task force, on the committee, need to really step up and have that conversation in a diplomatic way where people can hear you, so that it can be something that can be constructive to get to a constructive solution that's going to assist individuals who are voiceless, who don't have the opportunity to be in those rooms.
Yeah, Trudy, I completely agree with that. And inside of that relationship between Melody Hobson and Jamie Dimon is some trust and also some tolerance for failure, because you're not going to say it right and get it right every time. But you have to be willing to stay engaged in the conversation, particularly when it gets the most uncomfortable. When people talk about this, they talk about resisting that urge to retreat when the conversation gets uncomfortable. But I would also say, and this is really for people of color, and I hold myself to this account as well, is resisting the urge to cancel, because you have to remain in dialogue and continue the conversation. But the important part of that is it has to be a conversation and not a quizversation. Meaning, what sometimes happens with people from the global majority is that sometimes we end up having to answer all the questions, and it starts to feel like a quiz. In terms of those who are wanting to be allies engaging in this work, they have their questions and they come with those questions, but there's no accountability for them to think deeply about their own role in how this all works and how it all will be dismantled. Because questions they are cognitive in nature, but they don't always require you to think about what role you play, because you're only seeking some information from someone else. And so it has to be dialogue, it has to be rapport, it has to be conversation, but then ultimately, like we heard from Jamie Dimon, it has to be action. And that action had to be taken place by his leadership, and then providing for others to be empowered to take on decision-making roles, no matter where they're situated in the agency organization, to be able to make true change happen.
Yeah, there's this great quote, and Charles, I'm gonna let you get back to your question, but there's that just really triggered this great quote from Isabel Wilkerson from CAST. And she said, "The price of privilege is the moral duty to act when one sees another person treated unfairly. And the least that a person in the dominant caste can do is not make the pain any worse." And that's what resonates with me and what LaShawn is saying about, you know, pausing for a moment, not quizzing people, but really kind of seeing what actions you can take as, you know, somebody who's trying to get better.
One of the things that strikes me as we're having this conversation, and we have about 7 more minutes, so I'm going to get this thought out and then ask the, 2 more lightning round questions. One of the things that strikes me as we're having this conversation is that there is a lack of dialogue sometimes around these critical issues, and we don't necessarily have the muscle memory or the skill set to be able to engage in these conversations in productive ways. I think that a lot of what we bring to the table, are our own experiences, but it's also the cultures that we have grown up and lived in, and how those cultures have been passed down through history. And so one of the questions that came from the audience is, how can we engage majority populations in learning about the necessity and purpose of this work? And as a follow-up, how can the majority successfully engage in and lift up this work? And I'll add the caveat. That I think that oftentimes we place the onus of solving this work on folks that that are most impacted by it. And then the second caveat that I'll add is that the second caveat that I'm going to add is that as we continue to think about how this work occurs, we need to think about the value of diversity in an ecosystem. Every ecosystem has a diverse set of inputs. And so diversity in and of itself, I think, has been created or casted as a pejorative, but we are really reflecting the value of diversity in ecosystems that exist across the world. And so I'll repeat the question for our panelists, and whoever wants to take this, go first. How best can we engage the majority in learning about the necessity and purpose of this work?
I'll start, and then the panelists can add in it. I do think that this is not a passive thing; it's an active thing in terms of learning. And there are lots of things that we can learn. But as a leader of teams, I have to think about diversity, equity, and inclusion in everything I do every day. I cannot be passive about it. It's got to be active. I got to think about hiring, training, and retaining my employees. As I think about that, we have a lot of, I've done some personal learning too. Things around, unconscious bias, which I know we've all been kind of looking at those things. How to have courageous conversations. How to start, learning about things that I never knew about until we had, things like code switching and, other activities that, are part about cultures that we don't really understand. So I think conversations are really important for us to get on common, kind of common understanding to really move the work forward. And, this is a call to action today. This is something we have to start today. It's not a tomorrow thing, it's a today thing. Or we will be left behind. So, I do think, we've got lots of great resources, and I'm sure the other panelists can help us, with some additional resources in the community as well.
And I'll piggyback on that and say that for those who are curious about why this work is so important, I would say to look at your outcomes and fundamentally pay attention to what it is that you're hoping to achieve as an organization, and see if you're meeting that in a very disaggregated way. I think it's important. I think Kiana talked about it earlier, is that when you look at your data and you think about the intersectionalities that might exist within your data, the only way you can truly distill that is if you disaggregate your data. One of the things that we've implemented in our organization is that we have a motto that we will disaggregate all data to the finest detail that we can, so that we can truly see if our outcomes is having a negative consequence on a specific constituency, and then build our responses around that constituent first, and then figure out how it can support other areas. Because I think our responsiveness will be based upon the information that we have access to, and then the accountability becomes, how are you addressing that for the ones that are the furthest from opportunity? And so I think that's, and so for those who may not understand why this work is so necessary, I would say that there needs to be a conversation around what the data is telling us and how we are responding to those data points. And then also just have a conversation about the lived experiences of the people that are sitting next to you, beside you, and want to be a part of the conversation. And what access have they had to be able to do that historically and even in present times. And if we can see that there's been some underrepresentation in engagement, then we have to open up all pathways to make that reality, make that a reality for our system.
You know, what I'll add to that, Charles, is, you know, going back to, you know, the first part of your question around, you know, how do we engage, you know, white folks in the conversation? Well, part of it is that we have to reframe the issue of racism away from a Black people problem to solve to an American problem to solve. You know, Dr. Shawnita Seeley Jefferson at OSU, she was on a podcast the other day, and one of the things that she said is that, you know, there aren't enough Black people in the world to solve racism. We didn't create it, we didn't invent it, and we don't profit from it, right? And so, you know, having everybody, you know, understand that solving racism is everyone's to solve is how we get better. And, you know, I think for, you know, white folks who are listening today, it's really about being willing to be influenced. And so, you know, a lot of times people can ask for more data and more data, like I need to better understand this, or, you know, can go to the immediate reaction of, well, you know, I didn't own slaves, or, you know, blah, 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 like those types of defensive mechanisms, right? And so it's in those moments, right, when you start to feel uncomfortable, when you start to feel defensive, to just pause, right, and understand what's happening inside of you in that moment, so that you can get to the other side and be a part of the solution. And I think that that's really what we have to get to, is a place where people want to be a part of the solution, and they also see their own individual interests as intimately connected to this. There's this great book called Dying of Whiteness, and it talks about how oftentimes white people actually do things that are against their own interest in an effort to not address issues of racism. And I'm not going to get too political right now, but I think that we see it, right, in how people vote sometimes, or, you know, people's support for certain public policies, and really trying to unpack that so that we can really solve real issues around race and racism, are how we begin to actually solve this problem.
Thank you, Kiana. Incredible. Trudy, do you have anything to pitch in on the question?
Yeah, I would just say that just in what I have been doing with a group of women, and you may know them as the Edge Sisters, we brought White Fragility to the library where everyone was able to hear it. And we came together as friends around at a dinner around affordable housing. And that has blossomed to conversations around race, where at first it's a very diverse group of white women and African-American women, and we have very candid conversations. And we've gotten to the point where it was uncomfortable for them to ask questions that they felt that they are uncomfortable to ask. And now we have conversations where we see what we've discussed has really gravitated towards what they're doing in their professional lives. Many of them are CEOs of companies here in Columbus, and every Wednesday we get together and we talk about our week, and we hear about how that conversation made you be aware of something and you took action where maybe before you would not have. So I think it's a broad conversation, but it's also intimate conversations where you get to know people more so than you have. You can say you're friends, but sometimes if you're friends and you go to people's houses for dinner and you know their children's names. But if you don't know that, then you're really not friends, you're acquaintances. And so how do we have that deeper relationship and become friends and be able to have these conversations and agree to disagree and just move forward and have that information and those experiences really move into our professional lives?
Thank you, Trudy. Great words to end on. I wish I was skilled enough to be able to summarize all of the great points we've heard today. I'm probably gonna have to listen to this 3 or 4 times to really soak all of this in. But just want to say thank you all for joining us in this incredible conversation today. I hope that everyone who's been able to listen and to participate has had the opportunity to really pull out some very discrete items that you can take with you in your walk. Intimate conversations, thinking about the disaggregation of data, thinking about reframing the conversation of race, and thinking about Kareen's point around this call to action, or we will be left behind. This is not the end of the conversation. This is really the beginning of the conversation, as you said, Trudy, really initiated through the investments made by the Franklin County Board of Commissioners and President Hardin, Joyce Beatty, and others around the city to help us move forward as a region. And so just want to thank you all. We are going to take a short break while we get our other panel set. And so audience, please hold on for a moment. We'll be right back. Thank you. Welcome back. Thank you for this brief pause while we queued up our second panel. Want to say thank you to our industry panel for really providing great insights. I know that I personally learned a lot, and I hope you did as well. We're going to move next to our K-12 panel. But before we do, we have a few housekeeping items. With the first session, as with the first session, we're also going to be taking Q&A in the bottom right-hand side of your screen. And so please feel free to submit questions. If you weren't able to submit a question or we weren't able to answer questions for the last session, please send to the contact email address that you'll be able to find in the chat. And so as a reminder, we'll be verbally addressing these questions. We won't actually be responding in the chat. And so we hope to get to as many as we can. I'm excited to introduce the moderator for our next session, first team all conference, Dr. Tom Goodney. Dr. Tom Goodney is the superintendent of the Educational Service Center of Central Ohio and has been a key partner in the Central Ohio Compact and really a key thought leader in Central Ohio around all things K-12. Dr. Goodney, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Charles. I'm glad this is recorded. We can send it to my parents and let them know once and for all that I did have at least one accolade in high school. Welcome back, everybody. Very excited to see 145 attendees, I think, plus the panelists and others. So a great group today. Also, to the first panel, please accept my gratitude. What an awesome session. Wish we could have just continued that for the balance of the rest of the morning. I want to just do a couple of quick thank yous before we get to the panel. Thanks to Dave Harrison and his team from Columbus State. This has been an ongoing partnership spanning now a decade, but this work in particular has truly brought our teams together in arguably the most meaningful way, surpassing any expectation that I had as we launched into this. So thank you to them. Also, thanks to my team who've been directly involved with this effort, especially Christine Galvin, who's with us today, Dr. Sierra Austin, Dr. Tom Reed, and Dr. Megan Johansson that many of you saw going over some data in the previous session. So our teams have assembled a very accomplished panel for you today. These are K-12 leaders who have each pursued diversity, equity, and inclusion work in their roles, in their districts, in their communities. I've asked each of them to give a glimpse into their equity journey or their equity journeys, after which I'll ask them a follow-up question or two as time permits to probe further into their efforts in their school districts. And as Charles mentioned, participants will have the opportunity to submit questions, and as time permits, we hope to get to as many of those as possible. So to our panel, and those in charge of the video, even if it's themselves, go ahead and reveal yourselves, please. Heidi Kegley, Superintendent of the Delaware City School District, is with us today. Dr. John Kellogg, Superintendent of the Westerville City School District, is with us today. Dr. Jackie Merkel, Assistant Director of Equity and Inclusion with the Olintanji Local School District, and Dr. Dion Blue, Chief Equity Officer with Columbus City Schools, is with us today. Thank you to all of the panelists for being with us today. So Heidi, I'm going to start with you, and we'll work through the panelists' names as I just introduced them. Talk a little bit about the equity journey in Delaware City Schools and in the Delaware community, since you've been the superintendent. But I know some of this work started before you took that role, when you were in your role as assistant superintendent.
Yes, good morning. Thank you, Dr. Goodney, and thank you to everyone. This has truly been an incredible opportunity to learn and continue to grow. So I appreciate the opportunity to share just a glimpse, as Dr. Goodney shared, with what's been happening in Delaware City Schools. Prior to me becoming the superintendent, we knew that there were things that we needed to be doing, and we needed to be doing better for our students and for our community. One of those pieces started with reading All-American Boys, both as a district administration team and as a student team at our high school. What we did with that was follow up with those questions and those leading conversations that needed to happen within our building, as well as them bringing Brendan Kiley and Jason Reynolds to speak to our school and to our community. It provided a platform and a foundation for us to start having some of the conversations that were needed, but also having that opportunity to listen to others and their experiences. In addition, we started a book study this year. As a new superintendent, I knew I needed to be doing more. And so that book study started with Not Light But Fire by Matthew Kay, or choosing the other book, Stamped by Jason Reynolds. We've now started our second session of that book study, and it is open to all staff within Delaware City Schools. So it does not matter what your position is, because all positions are valuable, and we need to have the opportunity to learn and to grow together and to listen to one another. Dr. Sierra Austin has also been an integral part of our journey in starting this conversation. She started the year with us providing information in a program based on implicit bias, as well as confronting and an introduction to systemic racism. Both of these were available and required by all staff to participate. Dr. Austin has done an incredible job of bridging that work with our team of diversity, inclusivity, and equity. So we meet monthly as a team and with our students who are part of that team to start to develop what we need to see happening within Delaware City Schools. We're very fortunate to also have a strong partnership with our community. We have what is called our Community Unity Center, that's providing outreach and resources to our students and our families in our community, as well as we have the Delaware African American Heritage Council. In February of this year, will mark our third straight year that we've partnered with the council to celebrate Black History Month, culminating with a student showcase. The students of all cultural backgrounds have used dance, art, poetry, and the written word to express themselves in respect to the theme of the program. The Student Showcase program this year will be live and on Zoom, and we hope to increase the opportunity for those to participate. So that's just a little bit about our journey as we've started and continued the work.
Thank you, Heidi. I'll get back to you with some follow-up questions here in just a bit. Dr. Kellogg, talk about the equity journey in Westerville.
Thanks, Dr. Goodney. Always be a pleasure to be with an all-star like yourself and the rest of the team here. You know, in Westerville, I think there's three components that kind of stimulated our work. And one is we ground our culture on the belief about belonging. We always talk about Westerville City Schools, where you belong. And what we've said recently is, if we're going to say it, we need to be that kind of place where all people belong. The second thing that has become part of our work is just understanding our own self as a school district, our own demographics, and how they've changed and shifted significantly in the last 20 to 25 years as a suburb of Columbus. This is a Columbus compact, and I would remind people that whereas Westerville City Schools has the title Westerville, we serve 6,000 students with Columbus City addresses. So we are part of that relationship. And so understanding our own student population, understanding our own history, part of our history stems all the way back to the win-win component of Central Ohio and how that's impacted our school district and views about our school district. So that belonging piece, our understanding our own history. And then the third piece for me is, and it kind of goes back to the conversation we're having, public schools are viewed as the mechanism by which we accelerate people and provide them prosperity and opportunity. We're trying to take young people and mold them and shape them so they can be contributing members of society. That's probably in almost everybody's value system. But yet then when we look at the data, really what you see is public schools tend to just reproduce the social stratifications that we see out there. So we're set up to be something we say we want to be, but our outcomes don't seem consistent with what we say we want to be. And so those stimulate our work. And what we found over the years is that we've had multiple pathways going on in our journey, siloed opportunities, some HR work over here, some professional development over here, looking at each of these things as separate. And most recently, I think we've come together under a much more comprehensive plan with a framework, 10 key equity targets, and then building out infrastructure around building level equity teams that include staff, student voice, parent voice, community voice, and a district equity team as a means by which we can go to that kind of second tier of really digging into the policies, procedures, the data around the big chunks of work that we have, the diversity of our workforce, how our curriculum represents the variety of students that we have, how our materials represent that, how our pedagogy represents that, how our outcomes for student academic performance reflect all that. So I think we've moved from kind of this multiple paths, fragmented, siloed approach to a institutionalized, organized approach that's intended to make us the kind of place we want to be where all of our students feel like they belong.
Thanks, John. Jackie Merkel, you all have been very busy in Olintanji the last several years. Talk about the equity journey in Olintanji.
Thanks so much, Dr. Goodney. I was really resonating with what Dr. Kellogg was sharing because a lot of the journey that you're currently on and have been on really parallels some of the work that we're doing in Olintanji. Our work here really started in a formalized capacity back around 2010 when we had our first diversity committee meeting. And at that meeting, we had about 60 families that came. It started in someone's living room and just talking about experiences that their children have had with, discrimination, with racism, painful experiences that they've had in the district. And out of that, we have really born and grown an entire diversity program that is institutionalized, that is very focused and driven on the outcomes that we're hoping to see. Our mission is to facilitate maximum learning for every student. We have 22,000 students in Olintanji, and to meet the needs of every student academically, social, emotionally, thinking about their well-being, that's a huge task, one that really involves conversations about access and who has it, who does not, and how do we break down those barriers and what that equity can look like. Since the diversity committee started, from that, we really have we have diversity liaisons, which are teachers in our buildings that receive a supplemental contract, and they help to lead diversity efforts in each of our buildings. From that, we also have grown personnel that work in our central office. So alongside myself, I also have two fantastic diversity coordinators that really help us to meet the needs of our community, of our staff, and of our administration. And all of our work, we really ground and we center in a couple of different things. One is our strategic plan. So our district leadership and our board came to us and said, we want to make sure that equity is prominently highlighted and interwoven in our strategic plan. And so we made it a priority to ensure that that was a key objective that we are all working towards in our organization. So right now it's worded, promote a culture of inclusive excellence for all. And so from that, we have something to ground all of our work back into in a foundational document for all the decisions that we're making. The second is, as an equity and inclusion team, we really focus on trying to tie everything back to our 5 drivers of change. So those for us center on measurement and accountability. So looking at what type of data, what type of accountability and transparency mechanisms can we use to show growth and movement towards promoting equity. The second is recruitment and retention. So looking at what are the mechanisms that we're using to ensure that our staff is reflective of the students in the community that we're serving, and how are we benchmarking to check that we're seeing growth year over year. The third is training and education. So we really have built out a robust professional learning program. And we find that it's really important to target not just our certified staff members, so not just our teachers or our administrators, but also our food service workers, our transportation drivers, our secretaries, looking at how we can provide the professional learning to everybody really on a consistent basis to ensure that we all have common language and understandings of what this can look like. The fourth driver is policy and handbook. So really looking at how are we ensuring that the policies that we have in place that, again, drive our decision making, that our student handbook and the rules that our students are governed by are truly equitable and respecting the broad range of diversity that our students bring. And the last and a very important crucial piece of that puzzle, the last driver is stakeholder engagement. So that involves, everything from how are we involving students, their voices and their experiences in our decision making? What type of outreach are we making to families within our community? What does that look like in terms of broad ranging partnerships and relationships with the community at broad? So that's kind of the form that our equity work in Olintanji has taken, and it's a journey. Year over year, we're growing. We have setbacks, and I think that if we ever think that we've made it, we're definitely not there. So knowing that we always have that room to grow is really important.
Thanks, Jackie. Dion Blue, relatively new to the region, roughly 4 months on the job or so, and in the district, Chief Equity Officer at Columbus City Schools. So giving consideration to the brief time that you've been with the district, perhaps share a little bit about what you've learned, what Columbus's equity journey has been, but also talk a little bit about the vision for your work and where you see the work going over the next months and years.
Certainly. Thank you, Dr. Goodney. And I would like to say first that a lot of the approach that we're taking really does mimic what Dr. Merkel, Dr. Kellogg have already shared. And what I know of the previous journey around equity for Columbus City is that there's always been really great work going on in the district for dozens of years. There's been pockets of excellence where we may have focused on one segment of our student population or another, but really just looking forward to how we can kind of bring those together, kind of to Dr. Kellogg's point about not working in silos, but really trying to give some intentionality to our work. And so my vision and my kind of go forward work is really about how do I kind of see what's already going on that's been really working well in the district, and see kind of to what Dr. Carter mentioned earlier, what is the data telling us about who is falling through the cracks or who has been disproportionately negatively impacted over time that we still have not gotten the outcomes that we want for whichever segments of our population, and really starting with that. So as we look forward to kind of what the work is going to look like, similar to what Dr. Merkel said, where is that focus on the strategic plan. So the school board is currently embedded in that work of deciding, what the strategic goals are going to be for the district. And equity is a very large piece of that, and really the lens that we're creating that strategic plan through. So that is going to kind of be the larger philosophical framework that we use to do our work. So that is an ongoing process that we'll be tying up probably in this next quarter. And then from there, really going next into an equity audit. And so we've already done some audits within the district and actually seen some equity issues in other areas already. And so we've already looked at curriculum, we've already looked at our HR processes. And so we want to just kind of, with that equity lens, look at everything from within the district, at the district level, central office level, as well as into the building and classroom level, so that we, go from top to bottom, bottom to top, side to side, and really look at all aspects of the district in terms of equity, because it all ends up at the end of the day impacting the classroom. But we still have to be able to look at, like someone else said, what is the training that we're giving to our instructional aides and to our secretaries, our bus drivers, our food servers. And those are traditionally the folks who get the least amount of training and who have the most interaction with our students. And so how do we make sure that we're supporting every employee group to help support our students, as well as supporting those individual employees in their experience with the district as employees. So trying to look at kind of all aspects and hoping that starting with the strategic plan that the board puts together, and then from there, the outcomes of an equity audit, that we can build a framework to move our work forward. And understanding that it'll be a multi-year process. We didn't get into whatever equity situations that, may be seen as negative, overnight. And so obviously those aren't things that are going to be immediately fixed. And so we're going to have to prioritize and create a plan, multi-year plan, to really get to that end goal that we want to see. And really leaning on, what of our community partners, and other folks that help us to support students and to support the work that we do. How can we best, engage and leverage those folks within the community and the business community to really reach those goals that we're going to be setting.
Thank you. So follow-up questions here. Heidi, I've been monitoring closely your work. Obviously, our office is supporting you in some ways, but one of the things that I've been curious of, and I could ask this of all the panelists, but talk about how you've incorporated the student voice or the youth voice in your work in Delaware.
Absolutely. Thank you. Students are the core of what we do. And for me personally, they were the individuals I needed to talk to first. So over the summer and at the end of the year before we closed to the pandemic, it was important for me to talk to our students, both current and former students. What were their experiences? How were they impacted by what was happening in our schools? And what were they willing to share with me? Or who were they willing to share with if it was not me? So I began meeting with them and listening to them. And then after that came out Dear Delaware, which was on Twitter. And I know many of our school districts had similar platforms. For me, Dear Delaware was extremely important because it was our student voice. It did not matter whether they were current students, former students, or individuals within our community, because each of them represented a unique story that needed to be heard, and they needed to share it with us. So I asked our administrative team to read through all of those stories and comments, and we started to talk about what that experience must have been like for that student who had that experience, and what were we going to do differently, and how were structures going to be put in place to ensure that those things weren't continuing to happen. One of the other pieces that started with that then was a couple of years ago, Social Justice Club was formed at our high school. And that group has really changed and evolved through the things that have happened in our society and across our nation most recently, and providing that space for our students to come together, as well as our African American Student Coalition. So for me, it's very important that our student voice leads a big piece of how we're moving as a district, because they are the ones that are being impacted, and we need to do better for those students.
Appreciate that, Heidi. Kind of staying with that same framework, John Kellogg, what kind of success have you had? What kind of strategies are you using to engage more parents in this conversation?
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, so the parent piece, the community piece is a huge part. What we see at school in our classrooms, and then is what happens at home in those dining room table conversations about experiences at school that are critical. So part of the intentionality of our equity teams is that the expectation that all those equity teams will include parent voice as part of that conversation. So we want to continue to bring that in. I mentioned earlier the kind of organizing work we did around our 10 key targets, similar to what Dr. Merkel was describing in Olintanji and Dr. Blue is describing in terms of strategic planning. So within that, family engagement is one of those pillars of, we got to be better at this part. Whether it's our ESL parents or special education parents, whatever grouping we want to look at, we have to get better at that engagement piece. And we have to recognize that there's a variety of different ways that people approach those conversations. And so some of that is that critical classroom to home conversation is the most important one. Nobody really cares what the superintendent has to say most of the time. What you care about is what your kid's teacher has to say about you and their kid. And so that communication, that two-way communication, getting our staff better equipped at having those conversations on a daily basis to assure our families, to boost their confidence, to make them feel part of the organization, to make them feel like they belong. I think that's the most critical piece. And it's probably the hardest part in a large school district with 15,000 kids and tons of people. So those are the thousands of little conversations that go on every day that really cumulatively define the culture of your district and how people are going to perceive you. And so we want to work on that piece. We want to work at the district level, and we want to bring as many voices to the table as possible through that structure. I wanted to, if you don't mind, I want to mention a student piece that I think is kind of interesting. We're part of the Equity Equal Opportunity Schools initiative. It's a nationwide initiative that's designed to help school districts look at their demographics of their advanced placement and international baccalaureate, and then strategies in place in order to bring more diverse students into those courses. Because if you look in those courses and you look at those enrollments, they're not very diverse. And so as part of that program, we surveyed students, and this was a game changer for us. When we asked students why they didn't enroll in AP courses, the number one answer was, I didn't know I was allowed. And that's a shameful response for us as adults to hear from kids. I didn't know I was allowed to take what in many ways is an important curriculum, arguably for a lot of different reasons. And so we had to change approaches to that. And I know we talk about equity in terms of lifting people up, but it's not just the leveling the playing field, it's then removing the barriers. So removing barriers like you have to do the summer reading, you have to submit this essay, and then examining our own invitation to kids and intentionally seeking out students, diverse students who had other metrics that said you could be successful there, and then intentionally having a one-on-one conversation with them saying, our teacher is saying to those students, I'd like you to take my AP course. We have significantly increased the diversity of our enrollment across those courses over the last 5 years, and it's become an entrenched part of our practice. And so we learned a lot from that experience, listening to our students, what they had to say, and then changing our practices.
Thanks, John. Jackie, in Olintanji, can you talk about how you all have focused on changing, otherwise modifying any areas in curriculum to impact students and staff during your equity journey?
Yes, this is actually a little bit of a newer part of our journey that we're really undertaking. And so we're going to be starting a multi-year curriculum integration project. It is what we've called it. And so this will be a collaborative effort between teachers across the K-12 spectrum, across every content area that we have, our curriculum team and our equity and inclusion team. And we're going to be taking the Ohio State standards. We're going to be using our curriculum blueprints that we have that we created specifically for Olintanji around big ideas, transfer goals, essential questions for each grade level. And we're going to be looking for where are those opportunities that we have in the curriculum to be able to teach and to talk more specifically about diversity and equity. We know that the curriculum is not it's not very inclusive and representative. A lot of times if teachers, such as in our English language arts classes, are choosing to read own voice text by diverse authors, then students are getting a lot of diverse experiences as a part of those courses. But across the board in a lot of our other courses, that's not the case. So for us, looking at resource selection is absolutely huge. Being able to understand how are we selecting resources that cover the gamut of different types of experiences that our students may have had, so that they can see themselves represented, their identities represented, their families represented. And what that looks like is really important. It's beyond just, I think a lot of times when we say the word diversity, I think we center the conversation around race, which it is very important to center the conversation around race and anti-Blackness. And I think that's very key to the conversation. But in Olintanji, we also like to broaden the umbrella, that when we're talking about diversity and we're talking about reflecting those experiences back, that we're also looking at LGBTQ, that we're looking at religion, that we're looking at ability levels, that we're looking at gender and gender identity. And so each of those different components, it is important for our students to have something to connect to. So, moving beyond just the easy openings where it seems like a natural fit in our English language arts, in our social studies, in our world language, and really pushing ourselves to think critically about how are we providing real world relevance in our math and science courses by investigating our community, by investigating disparities, by looking at statistics and data that impact communities. And I think that that's going to be a huge portion of that work. We're very passionate about not just owning that as a curriculum team or owning that as an equity and inclusion team, but really involving the voices that need to be at the table as a part of this integration project. Our teachers are the experts in their content. They know it up and down. They know the standards, and they can be a very powerful, important voice in determining what that can look like. Same thing from students, how we're involving our different student groups and different students that we have in our communities to get their perspectives on what have you found is missing, because we've heard from a lot of our students what they feel is missing from our curriculum and ways that we can improve. And so embracing that and really working that into all of the projects that we're doing moving forward, and also our community getting their perspective as well. We had 5 town halls on racial justice this summer. And we really heard from a lot of members of our community, especially from students and parents, of ways that we can improve. And curriculum is always, one of the components that is at the heart of it. It's definitely not a solve-all. As Dr. Kellogg said, the institutional, multi-pronged, multi-avenue approach is definitely what's needed to make sure that we start to see those shifts. But I think that it's hard to identify the areas in our curriculum that need that inclusive voice if we don't have the training, the background, the experiences to see what's missing, because many of us are teaching the way that we've been taught. And so part of that is, harkening back to the first panel, kind of being that disruptor, disrupting the traditional paradigms of how we've always taught, what we've always taught, and looking at how we can make our curriculum more inclusive for all.
Thanks, Jackie. Dr. Blue, the state's largest school district, 50,000 plus students. We've talked a little bit this morning about some of the silos that typically exist, where maybe there's been equity work going on, but it's not well synthesized, it's not well integrated. A lot of events, a lot of trainings and professional development going on, but not a comprehensive systemic response. And I was struck when we were talking yesterday that your vision for this work is really going to be about harnessing more of a systemic response to this and building the capacity within the school district collectively to move forward. Can you talk just a couple minutes more about your vision for that work?
Certainly. So really, kind of similarly to what has already been said, we can't necessarily train our way into equity or add curriculum and that sort of thing. We have to really look at every decision that we make, every policy, every process. And so part of the work that we're going to be doing is going back to, we're working on an equity policy right now, but going back into the rest of our policies, how we spend money, the way we create budgets, just looking at every aspect that could at the moment cause barriers that we don't immediately see. So sometimes it's easier to recognize those kind of obvious barriers that students or schools may face on a day-to-day basis, but we make decisions every day that impact outcomes for students in ways that we don't necessarily think about. And so really wanting to dig in, from that sort of systems mindset on how is the way that we do business, how does that help or hinder us being able to see success for every student every day? And so some of that may be about, really changing the mindset of even folks who don't have a touch to buildings on a day-to-day basis, because we do kind of get into the routine of, kind of to what Jackie said, doing things that the way that we're used to doing them, doing things the way that we've always done them. And so even though we're not trying to necessarily turn over the entire apple cart, we do want to make sure we look at everything, because there are times when we ourselves create barriers that end up causing a problem down the line that we don't even know why we do things the way that we do them. The only thing that we know is that this is the way it was given to me to do, and so this is the way I'm going to do it. And just being willing to ask the question, why are we doing it this way? And not in a way that pushes back, but in a way that is, genuine curiosity about our processes, so that we can uncover what are the things that we're doing that are beneficial for students versus things that may be just beneficial for us as adults. And a lot of times we do default to what's easier for us as adults, and that's not always what's best for kids. And so trying to keep that that student focus as the center, no matter what area of the district that you work in. And even down to how we do, flexibility around hours that other employees work. I mean, you name it, and it's going to all be on the table, because at the end of the day, in order to really create an equitable district, we have to create an equitable system. And, Audre Lorde said that the master's tools were never made to dismantle the master's house. And so we have to see what other tools do we have that we can start to break some of these things down. So there's always going to be the aspects of teacher staff development and things like that we automatically think of. And I think that's, part of the approach is also helping other people see their role in creating an equitable district. So it isn't that, now that Dr. Blue's here, she's going to fix it all, and it's all on her to kind of do all the equity work. There are 9,000 chief equity officers in Columbus City Schools, and that's how we have to be able to think about it.
Thanks, Dr. Blue. Open question to any of you. Can you speak to how recent current events, or even going back as far as last summer, such as the Black Lives Matter movement, the pandemic, have impacted your district equity work, specifically with staff, parents, and students?
Tom, I'll share something slightly different that I think is an important piece. So schools don't exist in a vacuum in their community. And so one of the things that resulted from the summer, we have a Westerville partnership that meets quarterly here that involves the school district, Otterbein University, the city, the Chamber of Commerce, and our public library. And we meet quarterly to share ideas and talk about what's going on. From the summer, that group took on collectively this discussion about racism as a community piece. And within that structure, we are sharing in building out opportunities for community conversation, planning events, agreement collectively as organizations. We're building out data sites to express to the community as various organizations where we are in this journey, the work we're doing, what the metrics look like, so that collectively as a community, everybody's just seeing it from the major players that are part of this, as well as our ministerial association is also part of that. So that for me was, of all the things that came out, that for me was key, because it doesn't leave us in isolation as the only place working on this. It's all of us. And I'm excited to see what comes from that from a community perspective. So I would share that one.
Thanks, John. Someone else want to try to respond to that?
Along with what Dr. Kellogg shared, something similar in Delaware, we started community conversations this summer, and they were every Friday. And initially they were open to attend in person. And then there was a time where we needed to do that virtually. But again, bringing in law enforcement, bringing in city officials, bringing in practices that involve our entire community, not just the schools, but the schools also had a piece in that. And it was an opportunity for the community to ask some of those questions that they didn't have answers to, or that we were struggling with. And it was that chance for us all to start to begin to work together. Again, that change won't happen immediately, like Dr. Blue shared. And it does take all of us. It's not one person that's going to create the change and make the difference that we need to be seeing in our communities.
Thanks, Heidi.
I could add a different thought. I feel like with everything that happened, transpired over the summer, I mentioned that our district had these town halls. We had 5 town halls on racial justice. I really think that what it has given us is a permission to tackle the issues that we've known have been going on for so long head on, like not to beat around the bush. Like, we are talking today about racism. We're talking about anti-racism. Like, we're not going to back away from this. We're not going to talk around it. And so a lot of our professional learning efforts that we've been doing with staff members, a lot of our conversations that we've been having with students are very direct and really seeking to try to understand what do we need to do collectively to tackle and solve these problems of racial inequity that we are seeing in our community, locally, nationally. I have been very proud of the way that our students have really stepped up to the plate as leaders in this work. We had multiple student groups that organized protests throughout our community that were very widely attended. We've had students that have volunteered to sit on our Student Leadership Advisory Council, on our Adult Leadership Advisory Council. They have created a 36-page plan of goals that they would like to see for us to adopt in Olintanji. Very ambitious, but wonderfully researched, created, fantastic ideas. And we are adopting many of the ideas that they incorporated as a part of that plan into the goals and our efforts moving forward. So I would say that the biggest thing that it has given all of us is that permission, and to, break away from that fear of, well, this is, I don't know how to talk about this, to we're just going to dive in and we're going to go for it, because you can't fix a wound if you don't start to treat it, and if you don't recognize that it's there. Dr. Kendi has this great metaphor of all of us are being rained on constantly, but we don't know it until somebody hands us an umbrella, and then we realize, oh man, I'm actually wet. And so I think that's what we're kind of looking at, is this is something that's been going on in our world and our communities for a really long time. And to be able to, talk about it so directly, I think is a really huge benefit of what came out of this national consciousness raising effort.
Thanks, Jackie. Anything to add to that, Dr. Blue?
I think the only thing I would add, because of course I wasn't actually here during the time of the unrest that was kind of going on right outside the door, but I will echo what Jackie said in terms of just the fire that it's awakened in those who hadn't necessarily seen it before, or hadn't noticed it or recognized it for what it was. And so now it's kind of helped bolster the work, because now it's less of a matter of, is this really a thing? And more so, okay, I see that this is real, and what do we do? And to just be really excited about the fact that we're finally going to be having conversations in a very direct way, about race and about the impact of race on all of us. And so it's been just an interesting moment, I think, in our country and in our world in general, that's really opened up the conversation in new ways that we hadn't done before, and bringing that into the classroom environment, because I come from a district where we don't talk about those things in the classroom. And it's just, we're past that moment where this is a moment where we have to be able to have those conversations with students, you know, and with families and teachers and all that, because we have to help students to be able to become critical thinkers. And if we don't bring real world issues to play in the classroom, then we're not going to get to that. And similar to what Jackie said too, I've been really proud of just how I've seen student leaders step up to the plate. We've had student leaders involved in our safety and security committee and other things. And these are super bright students who are really social justice minded. And if they are who I have to lean on when I'm an old person and need someone to feed me, I am excited to see what they're gonna do for us.
Me too. Dion Blue, John Kellogg, Jackie Merkel, Heidi Kegley, thank you for your contributions this morning. I wrote down takeaways. There were many more. Student voice is critical. We must engage our parents. You know, we could have a strategic plan for that, but generally we need to have a bias for action. It's going to look different, maybe within the same school district, depending on the school. We've got to engage our parents in this work. We cannot train ourselves into equity, and listen to the data, pay attention to the data, and follow where that data takes us to help inform our decisions that we make. So Charles, I'm going to turn it back to you. I hope I managed this to your satisfaction this afternoon.
Tom, you exceeded expectations, you and along with the rest of the panel. This was really an exceptional conversation, and I love the intersections of our first panel, thinking about getting out of silos, thinking about integrated partnerships, thinking about ways to approach this work in a systemic way, and then transitioning to thinking about all of the points that Tom just raised, and then also about getting historically disenfranchised voices to the table. It is absolutely exceptional. I was listening to a speaker years ago in DC, and the person said that we spend so much time thinking about how to fix broken people, but never enough time thinking about how to fix broken systems. And I think there is space for both of those conversations. And I'm really happy to say and encourage that there's been so much thought around how we start to bolster our systems so that they provide the same levers of access to everyone living within our community. A few housekeeping items before we close. I just want to remind you all that we have a survey coming out. Please take the survey. We got really great feedback from the last session, which we tried to incorporate into this session. Following up with the Central Ohio Compact, these two series were designed to start a conversation in partnership with folks that are already doing this work around Central Ohio. And so the Central Ohio Compact will be meeting to debrief on these sessions and then to think about how we continue to deepen this work moving into 2021. And so we look forward to continued engagement and being able to move this forward. Lastly, I'm going to end with a quote that I love from W.E.B. Du Bois. He says, "A system cannot fail those it was never built to protect." And so we are building systems that are really designed now to start protecting those who are the most vulnerable. And I'd like to end by thanking everyone on ESC's team, incredible partners, the panelists for the K-12 conversation we just had, panelists for our industry conversation. Would like to thank Dr. Harrison again for his incredible leadership on these topics. And then finally, I'd like to thank Steve Dakin and Tracy Walter-Bush for really being incredible thought partners throughout the course of planning and execution of these events. Thank you all for joining. We appreciate it. We hope that you were left with some inspiration, with some tools, and with some hope to go back and continue to work towards justice and equity. Thank you all for your time. Look forward to talking soon.